Last spring, I was standing in the seasonal aisle of a big box store, looking at a Schwinn bicycle on a rack between the garden hoses and the pool noodles. $178. A man about my age was there with his son, and he tapped the top tube and said, "These used to be made in Chicago, until the union killed it." He said it the way people say things they have never once had to check. The kid nodded. They put the bike in the cart and moved on. I've spent a long time with the paperwork behind that sentence, and it has a timeline problem. The strike he was talking about began in 1980. The contract that moved Schwinn's production to Taiwan was signed in 1977. That 3-year gap is where the actual accounting lives. When a company leaves a city, the explanation that survives is almost always the one that assigns the cost to the people who stayed. So it's worth being precise about what Chicago had before it lost it. In 1895, a German-born machinist named Ignaz Schwinn went into business with a Chicago meat industry veteran named Adolf Arnold. They were not doing anything unusual. According to the Encyclopedia of Chicago, by 1900 the Chicago region was producing more than half of every bicycle and bicycle component made in the United States, and roughly 30 different bicycle manufacturers were clustered along Lake Street alone. Chicago was to bicycles what Detroit would later be to cars, and it got there first. The Illinois Factory Inspector's Report for 1895 lists 60 workers at Schwinn's original plant at Lake and Peoria. All of them were men, and only 2 were under 16, which in a Chicago factory in 1895 was a statement of policy rather than an accident. The company built its permanent home on Kildare Avenue starting in 1901 in the community area now called Hermosa, on a strip of ground pressed up against the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul rail line. By 1905, the payroll at Kildare was 160 adult men, 9 teenage boys, and 1 woman. In June of 1917, the trade press ran a story marking the 1 millionth bicycle built at that address. That's the base. Everything that follows was built on top of it. By the 1920s, 1 of every 7 bicycles sold in the country came out of that plant. By the early 1950s, Schwinn held about 25% of American bicycle sales, a share no competitor came close to. In May of 1963, the company introduced the Stingray, with the high-rise handlebars and the banana seat, and sold just over 45,000 of them before the year was out. For scale, a popular production bicycle model at the time sold roughly 10,000 units in a full year. Schwinn did 4.5 times that in 7 months, on a design the bicycle trade had openly doubted. In 1968, the Kildare plant built 1 million bicycles in a single year. That's the peak, and it's worth marking, because the conventional story treats the fall as sudden. It wasn't. The market share numbers were sliding, while the production numbers were still climbing. Schwinn's share of American bicycle sales fell from that 25% high in 1950 to about 12% by the end of the 1960s. By 1977, the company's share of 10-speed bicycle sales had dropped from 25% to 14%. European imports were selling around 2 million bicycles a year in the United States by 1970, while Schwinn was selling closer to 1. Through all of that, the Kildare plant was not retooled. It went on building heavy electro-forged frames because that's what it had the tooling to build. It could not produce the chrome molybdenum steel frames the growing end of the market wanted, and that growing end had a name. The mountain bike was rewriting the market from underneath, and the Kildare plant simply could not build them. Companies like Trek, founded in Wisconsin in 1976, and Specialized, founded in California in 1974, were reading that shift and adapting. Schwinn was not. So by the middle of the 1970s, the company was looking at a factory it had chosen not to modernize, and a product line the market was walking away from. What it did next is the part the aisle version leaves out. In 1977, Schwinn signed a manufacturing contract with a 5-year-old company in Taichung, Taiwan. Giant Manufacturing had been founded in 1972 by King Liu and a handful of partners with roughly $100,000 between them. It was a small contract shop with no brand of its own and no meaningful export business. Schwinn did not simply place orders. It sent engineering, development, and manufacturing expertise, and taught Giant how to build bicycles to American specification. Giant invested in automatic electrostatic coating equipment to meet Schwinn's finish requirements, becoming the first Taiwanese bicycle maker to run it. By the early 1980s, Giant was shipping about 100,000 bicycles a year to the United States, and Schwinn's orders accounted for roughly 75% of Giant's revenue. Now, the strike. In 1980, workers at the Kildare plant voted to join the United Auto Workers. Roughly 1,400 of them walked out and stayed out for 13 weeks. It was the first picket line in the company's 85-year history. Management, approached to negotiate a first contract, stonewalled. The strike settled in 1981 with modest gains in wages and benefits. During those 13 weeks, Giant offered to cover the shortfall and delivered an additional 80,000 bicycles in about 5 months. Judith Crown and Glenn Coleman document the sequence in their book on the company, No Hands, and the conclusion managers drew from it is not ambiguous. High-quality, low-cost production outside the United States was now demonstrably available on demand. By 1984, Giant was building 500,000 bicycles a year for Schwinn. That was about 2/3 of everything Schwinn sold. In 1985, Giant's leadership proposed a joint venture. Schwinn declined, and in 1987 signed instead with the China Bicycle Company in Shenzhen. Giant responded by launching its own consumer brand, under a new president who had previously been Schwinn's vice president of marketing. Read that sequence again slowly. A Chicago company taught a Taiwanese contract shop to build its product, used that shop to absorb a strike at its own plant, handed it 2/3 of its production volume, turned down its offer of partnership, and then watched it go into business for itself, using a Schwinn executive. In 2017, Giant sold 6.6 million bicycles and booked $1.9 billion in revenue. The Chicago side of that ledger reads differently. A new plant opened in Greenville, Mississippi in 1981. The last Chicago-built Schwinn came off the Kildare line in 1982, and the plant closed for good in 1983. About 1,800 people lost their jobs. Here is the part that should complicate the story for anyone who thinks leaving worked. Greenville never produced a profitable year. It was far from airports and highways, materials were hard to get in, turnover was high, quality control suffered, and dealers began canceling orders. The plant closed in 1991. Schwinn's net worth fell from $43.8 million in 1980 to under $3 million by 1983. The company took on roughly $75 million of debt across the decade. In October of 1992, after 97 years and 4 generations of family ownership, Schwinn filed for Chapter 11. By the company's own scoreboard, leaving Chicago did not save it. But the company is not the thing that survived, and this is where the accounting gets interesting. The Zell Chilmark Fund bought the Schwinn name out of bankruptcy in 1993 and moved headquarters to Boulder, Colorado. None of the Chicago staff went with it. Quester Partners Fund bought it in 1997. That entity filed Chapter 11 in July of 2001. According to the Form 8K that Direct Focus filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the bankruptcy auction that September was settled by a joint bid of $151 million, with Pacific Cycle taking the cycling division. Dorel Industries of Montreal acquired Pacific Cycle in 2004. Pawn Holdings of the Netherlands acquired Dorel's sports division in 2022. 2 bankruptcies, 4 owners, 3 countries, and the name came through all of it intact, which is how it ended up on a rack in a big box store between the garden hoses and the pool noodles for $178. The trademark was the asset that survived. The workforce was the asset that got written off. Those were 2 different decisions, made by different people, on different documents, and only one of them shows up in the corporate history. So, if a plant in your town closes, and the local coverage runs the company's numbers, the debt load, the margin pressure, the restructuring charge, understand what that reporting is and isn't. Those numbers exist because a company is legally obligated to produce them. The other side of the ledger, the household side, has no filing requirement. Nobody is compelled to publish what happens to a family's income over the following decade, so mostly nobody measures it, and the absence of the measurement gets quietly mistaken for the absence of the cost. The man in the aisle wasn't being careless. He was repeating the only version of the story that anybody bothered to write down. The household side has been measured, though, once, carefully, on exactly this cohort. Louis Jacobson, Robert Lalonde, and Daniel Sullivan published Earnings Losses of Displaced Workers in the American Economic Review in September of 1993. They used administrative records covering workers who left distressed firms between 1980 and 1986 after at least 6 years of tenure. The same window, the same kind of worker, the same wave of closures. Lalonde was at the University of Chicago, Sullivan was at Northwestern, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. They were studying their own city's disaster. Their finding, high tenure workers displaced from distressed firms sustained long-term earnings losses averaging 25% per year. Not 25% for a year, 25% per year indefinitely. The losses began before the separation date. They persisted past the third year, and the authors found little evidence that displaced workers' earnings ever returned to their expected levels. The losses were substantial, even for workers who found new jobs at similar firms, and larger for workers who had to change sectors, which, in a city shedding factories, most of them did. Apply that to 1,800 people, and the number stops being a rounding error on a restructuring charge. Then there's what leaves with them. The Economic Policy Institute's employment multipliers put manufacturing among the highest of any sector, with a single manufacturing job capable of supporting up to 7 additional jobs. The plant is the anchor tenant for the diner, the parts supplier, the tavern, the tax base, the block. And Hermosa's closure was not an isolated event. Public radio station WBEZ tracked the sequence across the west side. Schwinn's Kildare plant in 1983, Hasbro's Play School factory on Augusta Boulevard in 1985, Leaf Brands on Cicero Avenue in 1993, Brock's Candy Complex, about 3,500 workers in the late 1980s, finally closing in 2003 and demolished in 2014. Zenith and Helene Curtis, among many others. Citywide, the arithmetic is brutal. In 1960, manufacturing employed more than 500,000 Chicagoans and accounted for more than a third of all jobs held by city residents. By 2017, fewer than 9% of Chicagoans worked in manufacturing. Between 1967 and 1982, the city lost roughly 250,000 industrial jobs, about 46% of its industrial base, and during the 1970s alone, a quarter of all Chicago factories closed. Measured against the census of manufacturers from 1967 to 2012, Chicago lost 89.3% of its manufacturing employment. Chicago was not alone. This is what the Rust Belt looks like, city by city, plant by plant, when you stay at street level long enough to count. The losses were not distributed evenly. WBEZ's analysis found that 13 of the 15 Chicago community areas that were majority black in 1960 lost a greater share of their manufacturing jobs than the city did overall. There's a fair objection to all of this, and it deserves stating plainly rather than being waved past. The Kildare plant was genuinely obsolete. It could not build what the market wanted. Schwinn would have lost share to Trek and Specialized and the mountain bike, whether or not anybody ever walked a picket line. And Chicago's industrial decline was underway well before 1980, and had causes that had nothing to do with Schwinn, freight economics, land costs, suburbanization, automation. Teresa Cordova, who directs the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois Chicago, is blunt that the manufacturing that left is not coming back in the form it left. All true. None of it dissolves the transfer. Obsolescence explains why the workforce was cheap to write off. It doesn't turn a 25% permanent earnings loss into nothing, and it doesn't explain why the trademark got a soft landing in Boulder while the payroll got nothing at all. Those outcomes weren't determined by the market. They were determined by which asset had a buyer. Which brings this to the last thing that happened on Kildare Avenue. The factory was scheduled for demolition by 1985. The job was largely finished ahead of schedule in August of 1984 by a fire in the empty complex that investigators suspected was arson. The rubble was cleared. What was left was a vacant lot in the middle of one of the most densely populated community areas in Chicago, and it sat there, empty, for 20 years. In 2004, the Chicago Public Schools opened North Grand High School on the site. There are children on that ground again. They arrive at 8 in the morning and they leave in the afternoon, and the building they walk into was paid for by a city that spent 2 decades looking at a hole where its bicycle industry used to be. Some of their grandparents clocked in at that address. The man in the aisle had the sequence backwards, but he had one thing exactly right without knowing it. Those bikes were made in Chicago. The one in his cart was not. It cost $178, and every dollar of the difference between what that bicycle used to cost to make and what it cost now was collected from somebody, in a place with an address, over a period of about 30 years. Hermosa is still there. So is the school.